newspapermen meet such interesting people. They know the lowdown, now it can be told. I'll tell you quite reliably off the record about some charming people I have known. For I meet politicians and grafters by the score, killers plain and fancy, it's really quite a bore. Oh, newspapermen meet such interesting people.
The Media Project is a half hour of commentary and analysis where we talk about some of the major issues confronting America's news media and about decision-making in American newsrooms with some veteran journalists from throughout our community. I'm Rex Smith of the Upstate American, formerly editor of the Times-Union, here with my regular colleagues. Barbara Lombardo is here, formerly executive editor of the Saratogian and the Record of Troy.
Glad to be here.
And Judy Patrick, formerly editor of the Daily Gazette of Schenectady.
Hey, let's do something different today.
Let's bring in a pal right now, and here he is at our table, Ken Tingley. Also a former Upstate editor. Ken was for many years editor of the Post-Star in Glens Falls. And now we would say the playwright Ken Tingley, right?
I got to actually put my occupation earlier this week on a medical form, and when it said occupation, I wrote playwright.
Cool.
No one actually called me on it, though.
Yeah. Well, but I think it's a terrific thing. We all can self-define, you know. Ken Tingley, the reason that we call him playwright at this point is because his play is being produced. That is a play that he wrote based upon his memoir called The Last American Newspaper. And that is now being produced this weekend as we are being aired by the Adirondack Theater Festival. The only bad news is that it's sold out. And so listeners can't actually go to it. But why don't you tell us about what the play is, what it's about?
My book, The Last American Newspaper, and I'd been thinking about that title for a long time as I kind of went through those last 5 or 6 years of cutbacks into the newspaper, and that kept resonating with me. And I said, someday I'm going to write a book, and it's going to call it The Last American Newspaper, because I felt like I was living it at the time. But essentially, the idea of the book was to talk about all the great stories we had done over 2 decades in depth, and how they really impacted the community and made it a better place to live. And I thought that was something that was really needed. You know, and we had a lot of very interesting stories over the years. We had Mark Mahoney, our editorial page editor, witnessed a murder. I mean, you know, newspaper reporters cover murders, but they don't ever witness one. And that led to a domestic violence series, which turned out to be just one of the most compelling things we had ever done. We had a huge tanker spill in Fort Edward that we covered. We had, I think as early as 2000, a story called Growing Up Gay, where we had a reporter go and talk to young and old gays about what it was like growing up in the Adirondacks and what that experience was like. Now, keep in mind, that was 10 years before same-sex marriage was made the law in New York State. So it was far ahead of its time. And the most amazing thing to me was at the point when we wrote that series was I don't think we ever received such vile feedback as for that story. And a lot of it was because we ran a picture of 2 men about to kiss on the front page. But it showed the times we were living in, and certainly our community probably wasn't ready for it. Although 10 years later, when Roy McDonald in Wilton provided the key vote to pass same-sex marriage, it ended up costing him his public career. Mm-hmm. So there's those kinds of stories that I think are just very important to remind people of how important the work newspapers and journalists do.
Now, we in this room all lived through the decline of journalism, basically, as an economic force. Just to give a statistic, in 2002, the United States had about 40 journalists per 100,000 residents. 40 per 100,000. Today, the national average is 8.2 journalists per 100,000 residents. That's a drop of 75% over the last just over 20 years. And so that is a significant factor, I think, that you'd have to say in how communities have changed. And I think the story that you're telling is something familiar to us all. Judy and Barbara, what years did you leave your editorships?
So this month is my 10th anniversary of leaving the Saratogian, and I was 61. I called it a retirement at the time, and then I immediately regretted it because it really was a leaving. And I think because of my age, I said, well, I'm going to call it a retirement. But as Ken alluded to, My last couple of years at the Saratogian, it became so unnerving and so disconcerting and depressing. It was terrible, the cutbacks that had happened and the cutbacks that were yet to happen. And I just decided I just could not lead a paper that didn't have the very basic resources needed to do the job.
Judy, what's your story?
Yeah, I've been gone for 8 years now, and managing decline is so depressing, and I almost think we need a support group for the editors who have done this.
And here we are.
And here we are. Yeah, here we
You
are.
write a play.
But it seems like as soon as I ascended to an editor role is when the cuts started coming. I mean, 2008 was a horrible, horrible year. I mean, I have had so many difficult discussions and so many really talented journalists leave the profession, not by choice. And the managing of the decline, we thought we were operating at a bare bones level, and then we realized we were not, and that the cuts could go so much closer into the bone, and it was taxing, and you want to do a good job and you can't, and so frustrating. And I think that's why we witnessed the departure of so many journalists, especially editors. I mean, nowadays papers come to me, organizations come to me and say, do you know an editor I can hire, because there aren't many of them out there anymore.
And I feel bad if I don't want to sound like I'm maligning the Saratogian, even though it's a shadow of what it was, and even though that back then people said there's nothing in the paper, and I'm like, well, how about now? But the Saratogian and the Post-Star and the Troy Record, which was under my helm in the last couple of years of my being there, they are still publishing a print edition 7 days a week, and they're online 7 days a week. So there are a handful, literally a handful, of dedicated journalists that are doing the best that they can with the resources that they have to try to report local news.
What about you, Rex, at the Mighty Times Union?
Mighty Times Union. Well, I outlasted you all. I left the editorship the month before the COVID lockdown in February 2020 and stayed for a year as editor at large. And, I have to say, I'm very proud of the fact that, and admiring of the fact that the Times Union newsroom still produces terrific journalism. There's a lot of work that goes on, and that is really because I think Hearst ownership has protected their newsrooms. Right now, Hearst, which owns the Times Union, has just bought 2 more significant newspapers in Texas. So now not only the Houston Chronicle and the San Antonio Express News, but also the Austin American Statesman and the Dallas Morning News are purchased, a significant symbol, I think, of the fact that that company is still investing. And here's what I think makes the difference. There's no net debt on Hearst's part. And what has happened to the companies that bought, now we make an exception to the Daily Gazette because it's privately held. It's moved from one family to another, let's say. But a lot of American newspapers, including the Post-Star, owned by Lee, and the Saratogian, owned, well, now by, basically it's under private equity, Alden Global Capital. Yeah. The problem was, these companies rolled up a lot of local newspapers into their ownership by taking on a lot of debt, and that left them not enough revenue then when the information model changed, when the digital revolution came along. They had to service that debt, and that's where all the money had to go to pay off that debt instead of being able to hire reporters and editors. Ken, the Post-Star now, there is something there, but not much, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because I didn't realize it until later when I was giving some of these talks to local groups, and I added it up and said that the Post-Star went from 45 people in the newsroom at one point, and when I left, we had 10. And now they have less than that. And I don't know, I would say 7 or 8 they might have now.
Hey, in those later years, how did you keep morale up? Was that one of the challenges?
Well, there was less morale to hold up because there just wasn't very many people left to, really, the people we did have left were kind of the veteran journalists who have been kind of through the wars, the Mark Mahoney's and Will Doolittle's and Bob Condon's and Don Lehman's, so that was kind of our core when you only have 10 people. I think, and this came up when I was writing the play. I think there's a line in there at one point was that, every time we'd have another layoff of 4 or 5 people, you'd say, all right, this is it. We've hit rock bottom. Can't get any worse than this.
Weren't we silly?
Yeah, and then it would.
So naive.
Yeah, and obviously it got worse after. One of my defenses for calling my first collection of columns "The Last American Editor" was, well, actually, in my newspaper they didn't replace me.
Yeah.
So.
Yes.
So there you go.
I think last I heard, actually, I think you're overestimating the number. I think there are only 5 people actually working for the Post-Star.
Is that right?
That's what I heard from the last person who actually had a title there, managing editor. It's interesting how...
I'm just going by bylines.
Yeah.
I figured there must be a couple of copy editors. No,
I don't think so. And this has been going on in American journalism for a long time, of course. In 1991, I became the editor of the Record in Troy, at a newsroom of about 38 at the time. But the day before I started work, I rode on the float in the Flag Day parade. The publisher was on the back with his wife and 2 children waving to the crowd. But he said, why don't you get on the float and ride? Of course, nobody knew who I was. I was just sitting there kind of watching the crowd, getting my early exposure to Troy, New York. And listen to what people were yelling. They were saying, if you can slip it under the door, don't bother, because the paper had gotten so thin. And
1991?
1991.
Wow.
And my canary is peeing through your paper. So, it's there was already a lot of, and that is because the paper was owned by what eventually became taken over by Alden Global Capital. It was because it was owned by a company that was very early to the cost cutting. But it really took off between 2004 and 2019. Here's an interesting 15-year period. That's when Alden Global Capital bought up dozens of newspapers, and when Gatehouse merged with Gannett to form the largest newspaper chain in the country, half of all newspaper jobs were lost, and 1/4 of all newspapers folded. And 20% of the surviving papers, this is according to Megan Greenwell, who has written a book called Bad Company about this takeover of journalism by private equity. 20% of the surviving papers are ghost papers, which really just have a nameplate and nobody there covering stuff. So we've seen this happen so much, and I think the concern is not just, poor newspaper, but poor journalism, because the same impact is happening at local TV stations. It's just beginning now. I think we're going to see great threats and great decline to the only existing news organizations on radio, which is public radio, because commercial radio long ago gave up news. So it is a bleak situation for American journalism. And I can only say to listeners, support your local journalist, right?
Yeah, jumping on that, what would you say, Ken, would be the takeaways that you'd like to your ultimate play viewers to come away with and maybe sparked action on their behalf?
I think that's the one question that I hear all the time when they're talking about the newspaper, whether when I was talking about the book or the last reading we had of the play. People want to know, what can we do to get our newspaper back the way it was? What can we do? I mean, there's still kind of that feeling that they still want that. And I kind of do lay it back on the readers a little bit from time to time, because I'll say, well, listen, you're out there and they're charging you $200 a year now for a newspaper subscription, and you're saying, I'm not going to pay that. That's ridiculous. And I understand the quality's not there, but what do you pay for cable every month? What do you pay for your phone? What do you pay for your Wi-Fi? You add all those up, and it's a matter of what's really important to you. If you really, it's one of the mistakes the companies made. Obviously, they didn't put a premium on that, because what do we go for years and years and years? 25 cents for single copy sales, right? Then it went up to 50 cents. And I remember going through that and people saying, my God, you doubled the price of the paper. It's 50 cents, and you can't buy a candy bar for 50 cents. That was the kind of, we undervalued our importance there. And that was certainly a big corporate decision, or an owner, up in a higher level thing. But, people are always asking, what do you do? What can we do? And, I think some of it, we were talking a little bit earlier about the Substack columns. I have a Substack column. Rex is a Substack column. Anyone else?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet. And, there are some amazing work being done on Substack.
Absolutely.
Heather
some
Cox
people are
Richardson.
making, Heather Cox Richardson makes, $1.25 million a year from it. You're probably not making that much.
No, a little under that.
Me too. Because, and I think most of us who are publishing on Substack are doing it to get our voices out there more than to make money. I mean, probably 10% of my readers are subscribers, paying subscribers.
I think I'm 15. But
yeah. And that's fine for us because we're retirees. But people really need to think about, and we say this often on this show, people need to think about paying for what they value. And that is true of public media. If people are listening every day to WAMC, folks ought to be thinking, well, what is this worth to me every day? And putting some money into that.
Yeah, and breaking into the business is difficult. There's a man and a woman, unrelated, who are putting together an online publication where they're covering local news in Saratoga called The Dispatch. I think the gentleman was
Steve Thurston. Yeah.
Steve Thurston was editor. He was the managing editor of the Post-Star for about 15 minutes after you.
He had actually established a pretty good product before that.
Yes,
called
the Foothills Business
Review, right?
Business, the Foothills Business. Yes, it was.
And
it
then
was
he took
good.
the job at the Post-Star, and
Right.
now he's
he's got his own. So it's only been for a few weeks that it's been online, and now he has announced. So I can see it in my email, and it's pretty good, and it's interesting, and it's well written. But
very Saratoga oriented. Yeah.
Yes, and so that's the target. But it says it's going to go behind a paywall starting later in July, and I'm worried. Like, how are they going to survive on this? If that's indeed the plan to survive on it,
it's very difficult to get local. Very difficult for any entity to be supported behind a paywall because people are accustomed to finding information that's free, but you get what you pay for. And most of what is free it is either supported by somebody else's revenue or it is worth about free.
Yes, I hope that they have some larger sponsors backing them up to carry them forward, kind of like the New York Focus.
Right. New York Focus, a wonderful nonprofit
on a much bigger
newsroom,
scale.
has this terrific philanthropic support. And so they're able to do this great investigative reporting on the state of New York. I'm on this board, so that by way of full disclosure. But not everybody has access to that kind of money. They have a lot of donors from New York City, and they get national sponsors who are concerned about supporting the journalism ecosystem. The same thing is true, of the wonderful The Adirondack Explorer, which also does great work as a nonprofit newsroom covering the Adirondack specifically. But a little community like Glens Falls or even Saratoga Springs, where there's a lot of money from visitors, that's hard to find sponsorship from individuals, hard to find people who will do the philanthropy. There aren't a lot of big corporate titans up there willing to.
Right, and let's talk about even smaller communities like Granville and Sharon Springs and Dolgeville. I mean, those are the kind of communities that still need local journalism, and they don't have the people, they don't have the local business support there anymore. And what kind of foundation can they tap for their coverage of the local school board? In many respects, I think that we have killed ourselves. It's been because even today, local newspapers, we are not offering our readers, our listeners, a good experience in many cases. Try to read a story and you're interrupted by pop-up after pop-up ad. I mean, we need to get back to the idea that the reader is king and cater to them. Well, Ken, what are your thoughts about what can we do? What dose of optimism can you give us?
Well, I do think it goes back to old-fashioned journalism. One of the things I see with my former paper, the Post-Star, is they seem to be totally reliant on press releases. Now, I understand that. There's a certain place where you can do that, but they're ending up as, huge 80, 100-point headlines on the front page. I mean, it's painful, and I'm not trying to just pick on him for it. I mean, but, we had this was brought up, one of my former reporters brought this up. We had a double murder in Fort Anne not too long ago. And they I think they had an update on the case when the latest person was taken into court. And it was on page 2. A double murder, and that's a pretty big deal up in our way. And there really hasn't, and yet we have not had any kind of information about, well, what was the motive? What happened here? We have nothing from the authorities,
Sounds like they're not, that the staff is not tuned into what the readers, and what they as
what
curious
staff
people.
Is there again? The question
Well,
is
that's,
who-
and it's kind of the other thing that I worry about is, you were talking about places like Granville and different places. It's like, where do you get the next level reporter? Where are you developing the editors for the future?
I just like to point out, Judy just correctly pronounced Dolgeville, and nobody else does that.
I used to cover Dolgeville.
Did you really? How cool!
One of my first jobs.
Most people can't do that, and I'd say I had a publisher who came in when I was the editor of the Record in Troy, who could not say Scattercoke.
Much less spell it.
Never
Much less spell it, right?
I had an editor who had that word typed up and taped to my computer terminal.
SCHAGHTICO.
For that
Wow,
exact
very
reason.
cool.
Ken, I had a question about the play, and how does the content of your book translate into play form?
It's a 6-person cast. Made up of editors and reporters. Some of them are the real people named. Mark Mahoney's in there, Will Doolittle, Don Lehman. And then there's a couple of the reporters are like composites of several different people, and I tend to kind of use partial names and things to kind of as an ode to them. But the first act of the play has basically, it shows, it's the good news. It's kind of the triumph, covering all these stories that we covered and how it made a difference in the community. And of course, I don't want to give too much away, but it peaks with a certain person winning the Pulitzer Prize. That's the end of Act 1.
And that's really.
If
that
only
really
we could have ended there.
Exactly. And then, so you have this arc where you're building, and then it just all falls apart in the second act with all that angst of the staff dealing with all those crises one after another.
I just have to say, I saw a reading of this at Capitol Repertory Theater in Albany a few months ago, and it was just terrific. I mean, it is a really good piece, Ken. And it is.
Rex said something very interesting to me. I said, well, what did you actually think of the play? And he said, I was really surprised that I found it so entertaining. So I'm not sure what that meant.
I thought I was going to be just depressed, I was going to, more bad news about newspapers. But it actually was, there was suspense, and of course, and it was well done. This is a stage reading, which is what you're doing at the Adirondack Theater Festival. And I think the great hope is that this play might have further life, right?
Absolutely.
Is that it could have a fully staged production, perhaps?
That's the goal for next year. Of course, one of the things that came up was with the cut in funding to like NEA. One of the grants they were hoping to land was like a $50,000 grant. Does not exist anymore.
Yes.
So now that's money that will have to be made up in some other way. So that that's one of the things, like newspapers, people don't understand the expense. Journalism's really expensive. And plays are really expensive too. You're talking 6 figures or more to put on a play, even in a place like Glens Falls.
Wait a minute, I'm thinking major motion picture, and I'm wondering who's going to play Ken Tingley, and more importantly, who would play Mark Mahoney or Don Lehman. All great characters.
There's actually a guy named Nick Baruti who's from Queensbury, but who's done a couple of independent movies, and he played Mark in the play in Capitol Rep. and he's coming back to reprise that role. And I think he's better looking than Mark, but yeah.
Yeah, I think Tingley gets played by Brad Pitt, right? Don't you think? Yeah, no doubt.
My wife always said Clooney, but
Okay, settle for that. Well, that's all we have time for this show, but it's been a really fascinating conversation. Again, that play, by the way, is The Last American Newspaper. You can't see it just now, but you should be able to if there's justice in this world. Ken Tingley, thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
For the Media Project. Barbara Lombardo has been here, Judy Patrick, and I'm Rex Smith. We thank you for joining us this week on the Media Project. Grateful to our producer, Dave Gustina, and we hope you come back again next week for the Media Project.
Fight to wage, ting-a-ling-a-ling, newspaper guild, got a free new world to build, meet the people, that's a thrill, all together fits the bill. Oh, newspapermen are such interesting people, it's wonderful to represent the guild. Now you remember Mrs. Sadie Smuggery, she wanted money to buy a new fur coat, to get insurance she employed skullduggery.
The Media Project is a national production of WAMC, Northeast Public Radio. This week's projectors include former Times Union editor and current Upstate American Substack columnist Rex Smith, Judy Patrick, Vice President for Editorial Development for the New York Press Association and former editor of the Daily Gazette, and Barbara Lombardo, Adjunct Professor at the University at Albany and former editor of the Saratogian. You can listen to the Media Project anytime at WAMCpodcast.org or anywhere you get your podcasts. I'm your producer, David Gustina. Thanks for listening.
Now newspapermen are such interesting people. They used to work like hell just for romance, but finally the movies notwithstanding, they all got tired of patches on their pants. They organized a union to get a living wage. They joined with other actors upon a living stage. Now newspapermen are such interesting people. When they know they've got a people's fight to wage. Ting-a-ling-a-ling, newspaper guild, got a free new world to build. Meet the people, that's a thrill, all together fits the bill. Oh, newspapermen are such interesting people. It's wonderful to represent the guild. Now publishers are such interesting people. Their policy's an acrobatic thing. They claim to represent the common people. It's funny, Wall Street never has complained. Ah, but publishers have worries, for publishers must go to working folks for readers and to big shots for their dough. Now publishers are such interesting people. It could be prostitution, I don't know. Ting-a-ling-a-ling, circulation, ting-a-ling-a-ling, advertising, get those readers, get that payoff. What a headache, what a mess. Oh, publishers are such interesting people. Let's give 3 cheers for freedom of the press.